Hey, magic.
Okay, so we're recording.
Hello, everyone. There's a couple of people I even know here. So wonderful.
That's so great. And we may have some more people showing up. I'll just let them in as we go. I want to welcome everybody. I'm Alex. I'm going to be your moderator today, which really means just kind of being behind the scenes. And just wanted to ask everyone to mute because the background noise is not great for hearing, and it's also not great for the recording because we are actually recording. So the other thing I wanted to say is that basically Stephen and Wendell are going to have a conversation with Stephen interviewing Wendell. And then at the end, we'll have a chance for some Q&A. And if you could please type your questions into the chat, I'll combine those, compile and combine those, and then pose those to our esteemed guests when that time comes around. So without any further ado, I am gonna, let's see if I can do this. Great. I am just going to turn this over to Mr. Stephen.
Okay. So I'm very happy to have Wendell here. We were just trying to reminisce a bit, although both of our memories are completely faulty, but we've known each other since the mid-1970s and had many chapters of interconnection and independence. And so it's just always remarkable when people exist in your life in many different forms, in many different ways, and all of them very creative. So I'm going to give you a short bio of Wendell, which I'm going to read. Wendell Wallach has gained international recognition as an expert on the ethics and governance of emerging technologies, with a focus on artificial intelligence and biotechnologies. He currently serves as a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, where he's the founder and co-director of the AI and Equality Initiative. And additionally, Wallach holds the position of senior advisor to the Hastings Center and is a scholar at Yale University Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, where he chaired technology and ethics studies for 11 years. He is also the author, along with co-author of Moral Machines, which is right here, which was published in 2009, and more recently, a re-edition of his A Dangerous Master with Sentient Publications, which is an affiliated publishing house. I will admit that when Wendell came out with Moral Machines in 2009, I was, what is this, Wendell? What side trip have you taken now, which has, I cannot find the connection to our deep inquiry. And yet it seems that, yes, it seems that it was actually more prophetic than I realized at the time. And now that book is actually considered a very seminal work. And Wendell is oftentimes referred to as the godfather of AI ethics. And so this area of artificial intelligence and emerging technologies and ethics, that is, how does the human being that is generating this technology create something which is not only intelligent, but also moral, has been Wendell's work in this period. So I'm going to start off with a question for Wendell, which I would say, Wendell, like, give us an overview of what the importance, from your view, of morality and ethics in relation to technology.
Well, I'm among those people who think that we're in an inflection point in human history where technology is radically transforming what it means to be human. And There's a number of different pathways we can go down, from biotechnologies that create new species to artificial intelligence that can be connected to the human brain and perhaps augment our own intelligence, to ways of mitigating climate change through geoengineering, through nanotechnologies that can actually perhaps put little devices that can clean up our blood veins and so forth. So all of this, most of you know the science fiction. It's not, it's not like this is a mystery to any of us. Much of the science fiction is truly science fiction, but that doesn't alter that all these dramatic things are happening with emerging technologies, and they're transforming what it means to be human and what it will mean to be human in the future. And whether there's a place for us mere humans, for unenhanced folks, folks without necessarily a direct link to artificial intelligence or other capabilities. So as Stephen has alluded to, and as I suspect many of you on this particular podcast have spiritual interests. That's where Stephen and I met way back in the 1970s. And, we'll probably cross God knows how many subjects in the next hour, hour and a half or so. But, at some point, maybe we'll bring around the connective tissue to how my spiritual interests, I've been meditating for more than 50 years, inform my own views on the future of humanity, artificial intelligence, and what we should be doing now.
So, Wendell, in A Dangerous Master, you talked about a feedback loop as emergent technologies accelerate and change, feeding back into our life and the nature, the fabric of society and the individual. And I think I would say I'm seeing that in my life. I think collectively we could say we're seeing it, which is the inability to keep up with the radical change that's happening with technology. So how do you see that being solved?
Well, I don't see that as being solved, and I'm not a great prognosticator, though I've made some predictions that have turned out to be true. I think that radical feedback loop, as some of my colleagues like to say, is speeding up exponentially. And the pressures on us to adapt are getting more and more. And these technologies, we sometimes refer to them as technologies as if they're these autonomous things going on out there. But in general, we like to talk about socio-technical systems, meaning technical systems are very bound up in the social worlds that they both improve, enhance, or undermine. And of course, we're part of those socio-technical worlds. So it is really changing the fabric of our life. I mean, think about what your life was like before you had cell phones. For some of you, before you had television. Who we are, what's happening to us, what we need to assimilate, what we need to adapt to, it's speeding up. And it's not only speeding up, but these technologies are interacting with each other in ways in which they're ramping each other up. They're really accelerating each other's development. So sooner than later, we're going to see artificial carbon-based entities in our environment. Maybe it's nothing more than a mosquito that has been redesigned so it can't carry yellow fever or malaria or Zika. But those kinds of entities are entering into our environment, and they're changing our environment. Imagine going to Africa and being much less worried about yellow fever than you would be today. That changes who you are. That changes how you can engage being in Africa. That changes your levels of fear. That's an example of something that can maybe be beneficial. But we could also create a whole flock of new species that just destroy ecosystems, because ecosystems are pretty complex and pretty interentangled, and we have no idea whether letting loose, let's say, a new mosquito that glows in the dark, much like we all have lightning bugs now, whether that actually alters the relationship of that mosquito to the birds that will eat it. So we're moving into this environment with just changing at a pretty rapid pace. I'm happy to go into, hundreds of examples of that, but I'm less concerned with the examples really than our grasping the breadth of what is going on in human existence and how not only new technologies, but science in general is creating radical new visions of what it means to be human, what is possible, how we should look at things like consciousness, our own ability to make good judgments, on, all kinds of elements of human psychology and human capabilities that we're understanding in totally new ways. And those of us who have had sometimes realistic, sometimes fanciful notions about what's possible, at least have to accommodate these new narratives that are much more scientifically based. And for example, a lot of the spiritual philosophies were around the time when Stephen and I first met.
So how do you insert morality into a process which is likely largely driven by commercial interests, which are largely driven by profit and shareholder profit and probably just plain greed?
Yeah.
And maybe a small portion of university pure research. But you have these two forces, and then you have government sponsorship for military purposes.
Right.
I mean, is there any hope here, Wendell? Or
I'm always a cup is half full person, but I have to admit that there are times when I've had to adjust what I mean by a cup is half full. So I'm always looking at wherever we are today, how can we ensure a more positive outcome for tomorrow than might exist without our taking some concerted intentional actions? So I've even posted in a forum of, well, it's not inconceivable that rather than 9 billion people on the planet, we will have 6 billion people on the planet in 25 years. And all the pain and suffering that represents. But 6 billion is not 5 billion. So you're always in that position of doing what you can to make a difference, to ameliorate suffering, to maximizing or at least speaking to inequities. But yes, the trajectory we're on, that's great. It is not great at the moment. I'm actually waiting to see a few things about what's going to come out over the next few months as far as artificial intelligence before I assess whether we're getting, at least within that sphere, a little bit of a readjustment of the trajectory. I know, for example, Schumer is going to announce his AI bill this week or next week, and it's going to cost billions. And frankly, I hope it does cost billions. But I'm concerned about what the billions are going to be spent on. Whether, from my position, it looks like that we are going to be exacerbating inequities, or whether it looks like we are actually going to be addressing some of the issues around AI safety and its societal impact. So that's always where we are. It's always, a question of what creative people have to say, whether they get their voices heard, or whether we're in a world of corporate capture, where legislators don't understand very much about these new technologies. Corporations say, everything you propose is problematic, therefore, and you don't really understand what's going on. So really leave the management of artificial intelligence to us. And of course, that's a good way of ensuring that corporate greed dominates going here forward. Now, that's not to say there aren't a lot of people in these corporations who are good people and have good intentions. But we have moved into the world over the last 40, 50 years, where corporations see themselves in terms of their fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders, which includes some of us, though most of us have minimal shares compared to others we can think about. And therefore, they should not be engaged in the business of addressing social ills. And that really has come about largely since the 1970s. Interestingly enough, from World War II to the 1970s, we had a really actually relatively positive reset of the political economy of the United States and Europe, whereby a larger share of profitability was going to workers. And that's really turned around a lot. And now we are in a universe where there's been a growing and growing share of profitability and capital ownership going to the top 1%, the top 10%. So that's very different. And it's not just happened in the US, it's happened in Europe, and it's happened in other parts of the world, not necessarily as badly. But the point was, there was a time when corporate responsibility was looked upon favorably. Now we're in a world where fiduciary responsibility is what corporations think they're about. And they have a hard time being responsible, even on the level of contributing to the tax base of a country.
Hmm.
So
yeah. Artificial intelligence and the concentration of the application of it is going to, it seems, concentrate wealth even further, right?
well, it already has.
Yeah, so that seems like the people that control ChatGPT, et cetera, are going to be sucking in capital and taking over, replacing workers who are no longer useful, right? So this is
And that is a trajectory in artificial intelligence, automating work. Automating work and increasing autonomy. And the name of the game is automation has basically been screwing workers for the last 100 years. I mean, it's very complicated because we talk about things like the Industrial Revolution, which now from a distance, it looked like it improved standard of living for everyone. But if you get down into the nitty gritty, it was child labor, it was worker slums in large cities, it was lack of sanitation, it was gross. And it wasn't until the germ theory revolution in medicine set in and the sanitation revolution in public health set in, largely around the 1920s or so, that we started to see the improvement of standard of living for everyone. So, we're in the same boat. And a few things will be decided over the next few months that may help clarify whether there's any readjustment in that or not. But right now, the trajectory is pretty clear. Who's going to be the winners? Who are going to be the losers? A lot of talk about AI for good, but I'm not been convinced yet that AI for good is going to prevail in terms of AI contributing to more damaging conditions. I can even ask a few of you here. Of course, you aren't all here video-wise, but I've been asking at international forums for years now whether over the next 25 years people think the positive benefits of AI are going to be greater than the detriments. And it depends on which conference I'm at. If I ask at one that's on, let's say, the militarization of AI, people think it's going to be worse than better. But I ask it at a conference like AI for Good, which is a big conference that the UN puts on in Geneva every year, I tend to get more people to think it's going to be good than bad. AI for good, after all. That's what the conference is all about. But then I asked one more question. I said, how many of you think it's not really settled yet? And I get many more hands go up than for either of those other two options. And I think that's where we're at right now. Where we're at right now is we're making decisions, and they're basically policy ethical decisions about who we want to be, what kind of world we want to live in. And the question is whether people are raising issues around AI ethics, around the ethics of biotechnology, whether they're prevailing over the corporate interests that are maximizing their profitability, or the political interests that kowtow to the corporate interests because they get their campaigns funded. I mean, it's nothing's particularly mysterious that it's going on. But I'll give you one example of this. One example is right now, the big breakthrough in AI. Well, how many of you use ChatGPT? Yeah, so we've got more than half of you have used ChatGPT. So large language models and generative AI, they've been the big breakthrough over the last year and a half, basically. And what they're based on is these massive models, these massive language models or models of bits of graphics or so forth. It depends on whether we're looking at language models or graphics or audio models. And they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the only people who can afford to create them are, you know, the Microsofts and Googles of the world. And the big issue is whether those should be made more available to what's called open source. Open source is a term that goes back to software, and these are a little bit different than software, but it means basically accessible to anybody who wants to do something good with them. And the problem has been that these large language models open themselves up for all kinds of mischief. Deep fakes, scams, lying, propaganda. I could go on and on and on. And so how much do you want to make that available to your hacker son and daughter, let alone your, you know, mischievous nephews that you don't even know very well? So that's a real problem because opening up these models makes AI more democratic. Keeping them closed may or may not ensure that they're safer because they become the responsibility of the big players, but it doesn't alter the fact that all keeping them closed is going to mean is the AI oligopoly is going to be richer and richer and richer over the next 100 years.
So, Wendell,
money to buy legislators.
Wendell, if these models are based on scraping the existing information and recombining it based on patterns,
which
right?
They are. Yeah.
So the information that's being scraped is full of racial bias, economic inequality, disturbing realities that, let's say, liberal society we're trying to expunge, but actually they're being reinforced and regurgitated through this so far mindless AI. So what? Talk about that. Like, what's the solution there? And so you're posing that the democratic version is going to be full of more of that, but the one where Bill Gates is telling us what to think and to know has got its own biases, right?
Right, and it's they're promising us that they can make it less problematic. It also makes hallucinations, which is just a word for the fact it does some absolutely crazy things. It makes up law cases, for example, if you're asking it about precedences for a particular legal brief you're writing. But the fact is, the more advanced ones do less of that. Therefore, they want us to believe that they're going to solve this problem. But usually the solving of the problem is only the most glaring examples and only in certain realms. So if the bias were whether you, well, let's take our present political affairs. If the bias is whether you lie or whether you hate democracy, well, that's so fraught politically that they don't have to bother with that because there'll always be advocates on both sides. Now, they may bother with that because I know many of the leaders of these companies. companies. They're good people. But they're good people who I have seen time and time compromise their own values because of what is their fiduciary responsibility. I'll give you a quick example of that. OpenAI, the ones who've created GPT, ChatGPT, and many of these other programs, OpenAI was started as a nonprofit. And its mission was AI safety. They were going to create the tools to ensure that advanced AI was safe. But along the way, they had to scale big enough models to work with. And in the process of doing that, they realized they had a really valuable product. Thus, they're no longer a nonprofit. Microsoft, who for all purposes has bought much of OpenAI right now, or at least has invested billions of dollars into OpenAI. Microsoft has been telling us for years how ethics is in their DNA. And there's some truth to that. They have been the good guys. But they, along with OpenAI, released these tools that they knew were deeply problematic without having appropriate safeguards in place. Why? For the same reason we released it, social media and everything else, to get on board first and therefore have that advantage of being the one most people turn to. Most of you probably couldn't even tell me the names of the competitors to ChatGPT. And you may be getting into it more, and some of the others are coming at you. And if you're really into it, you'll read an article and you'll try Lambda or Poe or one of the other ones. But the point is that ChatGPT has the advantage because they came out first for the public. I'm trying to emphasize for the public because GPT existed before ChatGPT. In fact, ChatGPT is actually GPT 3.5. And the only point was that was the first one that was made available to the public. And within a couple months, it had hundreds of millions of users. And here we are today. It's been one of the biggest stories of at least technology history today, or at least one of the fastest that has come upon us.
I want to, Wendell, I want to shift a little bit into this area of consciousness in relation to information. So one of the things with ChatGPT is that it's literally running out of available information. In other words, it's consuming all the information that's available and it wants more. It has a momentum to have more information. And I wanted to bring this into your history as a meditator and an inquirer into the nature of thought itself.
Mm-hmm.
So in the same way, it seems to me we as human beings tend to look for more information as if more information is going to solve the human dilemma. And we now have invented this computer system that's doing exactly that. It's replicating the human mind and its voracious appetite for more. And then there's whatever it is that's attending to all this, which we could call, for want of a better word, consciousness. And so my question to you is, what do you see in human consciousness in relation to this technology and in relation to our own drives as human beings?
So let me go into a little history here, because I think that will be helpful. I mean, there has been a tension in philosophy for thousands of years between two different viewpoints. One has been called idealism and the other is materialism. And materialism basically says the foundations of everything are matter. Going down to even the Greeks, they had a word for atoms and so forth. And that idealism basically says it's thought or consciousness, which is the primordial substance. So if you get into some religions, it's very clear that matter is actually a condensation or has evolved out of thought and consciousness, whereby if you get into science, science has some fundamental questions about well, what is consciousness? And is consciousness really something that is separate from all the physical and material processes we see around us? This gave birth in the 1990s of a new science. Maybe let's even come back before that. So a lot of us were involved in spirituality going back to the 60s and 70s, meditating, trying to understand what thought was, what consciousness is. Does thought have a material basis, or is it just an ephemeral creation of consciousness? And what is the nature of consciousness? And most of us weren't looking at consciousness from some deep philosophical viewpoint. We're looking at more in terms of how can we tap into different forms of consciousness, different states of mind, and what does that tell us about ourselves, and what does that tell us about the structure of the universe that we're moving through. So that was the basics there. But along came, around that period, cognitive science, which was a compilation of psychology, computer science, philosophy, and a few other disciplines, anthropology. And it started to look more and more toward whether there is a material basis for much of what we have wanted to read as having some idealistic or philosophical or conscious quality. And that moved increasingly toward looking at, well, what is consciousness? And around the 1990s, a new field came into being called Toward a Science of Consciousness. It had a first conference, and it continues to have a conference every year. I think the first one was in Tucson, but I may be wrong about that. Was in Tucson, Arizona. And at the first one, a lot of spiritual people showed up. I'm including, some who had been meditating in Tibetan monasteries for 20, 30, even 50 years. And a lot of scientists showed up, and a lot of philosopher types showed up. And after the first year, the spiritual people started to sort of disappear, except for a few of the spiritual people who were able to also talk the languages of philosophy and science a little bit better. And the conference split between those who thought that we were making real headway on consciousness, and consciousness could be explained materially. It could be explained largely in terms of information and information processing, and that consciousness itself, human consciousness, the individual consciousness, your awareness of being here right now, looking at your screens and seeing this, this weird guy, talking to you and going on about consciousness and materiality. So the split was between the philosophers who said, well, there's something about what it's like to be conscious that can't be totally captured scientifically, or if it could, it's a very hard problem. And this hard problem and easy problem of consciousness, the easy problem of consciousness, which is not easy, which is really how do all these neurons and biochemical processes create consciousness? And then the hard problem is, well, what is consciousness? Was put forward by a young graduate student known as Dave Chalmers, who was at the University of Indiana at the time, at the very first meeting, and that caught everybody's fancy. Oh yeah, the hard and the easy problem of consciousness. But then there were the others who were the scientists who were not so interested in the philosophical issues, how these qualities, sometimes referred to as qualias that we experience, so the yellowness in my shirt or the redness of red, these are what are called qualia, how the qualia are experienced by humans. They're much more interested in what can be deduced scientifically. What are neurons doing? Are neurons interacting in a computational way? What are biochemical processes? And what came up for them was whether there were neural correlates of consciousness. That was the big question for the scientists. Is there an area of active neuronal activity that activates every time you're conscious. And so far, they've failed to find a neuronal correlate of consciousness. So I don't mean to get too deeply into that, but this is going to bring us back to the artificial intelligence and back to probably what I think is the fundamental question for all of us here in this particular podcast going forward. That would not be true for other podcasts I do. And that's it. Basically, there is a scientific description out there that all you need is evolution, neuroscience, along with neurochemistry, neuroscience, including neurochemistry, and a computational theory of mind. And with that, you can explain everything that goes on in this flesh sack. So that's really a form of scientism that says everything can be explained in that way. And that form of scientism is also within a lot of artificial intelligence, which is basically saying we are going to create systems that are smarter than humans in all conceivable respects. That is, again, scientism. Now, there's some of us who resist that extreme form of scientism. But the question is, are we resisting it because it's kind of a blow to our egos to find out all of our more glamorous thought processes? Or do we have something more substantive to say? Is there something that is not happening with artificial intelligence? And is there something happening within humans that probably can't be reproduced technologically or computationally? And if that's the case, then what is that? And what does that suggest for the future? I frankly think if that's true, and I believe it is true, but I'm willing to acknowledge that I'm just one more self-deceptive human being who doesn't want to accept the reality of our being so physiologically grounded. I believe that is the case. And if that is the case, then I believe that points a future direction of the complementarity, the symbiotic relationship between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. The other view points toward autonomy and the creation of computational systems that are much smarter than us, eventually in all respects. Now, when is that eventually? Well, Ray Kurzweil thinks it's happening this decade. A lot of people don't think it's happening this century. But the preponderance of computer scientists have bought into this, and they think it's happening in the next 50 years or so, if not sooner.
So, Wendell, I'd like to push into what you're saying a little bit. So, modeling a little bit about how artificial intelligence could, let's say, become conscious, then we're talking about things like embodiment, where the AI is actually in a physical form that's sampling the physical world, or intersubjectivity, where the artificial intelligence is recognizing you and its relationship to you, right? So these are areas that we would say have something to do with consciousness, and it seems like that could be easily understood in AI. If you extrapolate where we are now going forward, robotics and just the crunching of huge amounts of data. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out how to relate to another human being, and that's the limitation of my system. But if I had an immense availability of all relationships and all structures, maybe I would do better at that. On the other hand, maybe it's not in that realm at all. Can you just speak a little bit to that, the extension of AI into embodiment, intersubjectivity, and the kinds of areas we think of as a conscious being? And is there a space that AI cannot reach that we already have access to?
So I'm going to first try and talk to you about this intellectually, okay? Ideas, words, cognitive science, philosophy. And then if possible, I'm going to try and shift into a cognitive mode that is less rooted in words and concepts, okay? So yes, if we're talking about our kind of consciousness, or consciousness as it manifests in our individual lives, it is embodied. And it has sensory organs, and it has a certain kind of physical relationship to the world we're moving around. And there are people in AI and more broadly in fields like emotional intelligence, theory of mind, and so forth. We're trying to reproduce the different elements of that for computational systems. Will they succeed? They may. They're already succeeding with sort of mild semblances of what some of that is. In other areas, it's more than mild. Our AI systems don't have our situational awareness, but they can have visual acuity that's greater than ours. Just to give you an example. So we have all of that. We have all of that going on, and the problem will always be that no matter what you raise that perhaps AI can't do today, somebody said, well, it's just a matter of time. And whether it's a matter of time, though, has something to do with what consciousness is. Consciousness remains the big mystery. But I want to make a distinction here between those of us whose spiritual practices were very much about exploring different states of consciousness, different mental minds, and those who are really asking the philosophical question, what is this thing called consciousness? And it has continued, and I think it will continue well beyond my lifetime to be the big question, whether consciousness is computationally reducible or not. Now, the materialist viewpoint, the physicalist viewpoint, is that consciousness is a natural emergent property that will come out of a certain degree of information complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And the person who has put forward the most embraced model of that is a philosopher at University of Wisconsin, I think Tononi is putting that forward. And that's the one that gets talked the most in the circles around toward a science of consciousness or toward a philosophy of consciousness. So that's the intellectual background, okay? But I think for most of us, that's not what the consciousness question is about at all. The consciousness question is about, what is it about consciousness that makes our lives vital, meaningful? What can we learn about it? In the exploration of it, can we transform ourselves in ways that we consider positive? Does it point towards something about the evolution of humanity in different forms than are pointed to by enhancing yourself biologically, designer babies, or by linking to computers? So when I meditate, I'm interested in this question about whether consciousness is produced by this mind body, or whether consciousness has a quality that is transcendent that I'm just plugging into. Not necessarily the pantheism or panpsychism, where rocks are conscious. I don't know that rocks are conscious, but that's a different story. It's just that consciousness is something potentially all pervasive, that for some reason this biochemical computational system that has evolved over time has a relationship to that is allowing us to be creative, to have common sense, to feel, to love, to be totally submersed and engaged with our environment or our projects or each other. So I think most of us are exploring that, and exploring in the realms of self-understanding. Let me give self-understanding two sides to it. One is I'm neurotic because my mother acted like this way when I was 3 years old. And if I can just become conscious that I'm neurotic in that way, maybe I can diffuse my neurosis, right? So that's personal self-understanding. But there's also cognitive self-understanding, which is, well, we are to some extent computational instruments, and genetics has left us with certain cognitive flaws. We're bad at statistics. I mean, I don't know how many of you know much about the world of cognitive flaws, but we've come up with a massive number of human cognitive flaws, common mistakes we make because of the kind of creatures we are, or because of the way we evolved. And a lot of those flaws, we wouldn't make if we, rather than reacting to situations around us, we slowed down, we slowed our thinking and really thought problems through. But we, that takes a lot of energy to think a problem through. It doesn't take a lot of energy to just react to different phenomena around us. So the point is, it's one thing for me to recognize that I have personal flaws because of the life I've lived or the things I've identified with. It's another thing to recognize I carry some of the flaws of the human condition. And it's not, I don't care if I know all my flaws. I don't care if I know all of my neuroses. I don't care about any of that. All I care about is that when a situation comes up where those get in the way, I catch it so I can respond more adequately to the situation at hand. Not just adequately, ethically.
Mhm.
So I can respond in a good way that has the potential to solve the challenge at hand. That I can solve challenges at hand so that I know that I'm in the right place at the right time in the right way, to rewrite Mr. Aristotle. And I happen to think there is something about self-understanding and the spiritual quest that can lead to that. It's what I call a silent ethic. And to make it very quick, the silent ethic is just simply saying when confronted with choices and a challenge, move toward those choices that make you quieter inside. Once upon a time, maybe that was called a good conscience, but most of us have nothing to do with conscience at all. It just has to do with bringing yourself toward a more integrated place. Why that's an integrated place, why that's an integrated place from the perspective of evolution, those are all other topics that I don't think I'm going to get into today. But perhaps I've brought us through enough that we can see if there's some questions from some of the others who are tuned in here.
I don't have any right now. We could see if people want to jump in with something, but otherwise, I think what
Well, I have a question.
And I can keep talking, I'm sure.
And I'll have a question while people are getting warmed up to the idea of asking their own questions. And that is, so in the model that you were alluding to, there is this, let's say, field of consciousness that exists that we can tap into or we can connect to, right? So this is in some sense producing the form that we see. I think that's what you were saying. And if it's
a little bit more careful than that, Stephen, okay?
okay.
I don't know, and I'm not sure how I could know. But in my meditation, I try and explore that. And I sometimes come upon what feels to me like being in a field of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always this problem about what's subtle projection, what has been manufactured by your psyche because that's what you want, confirmation bias, or that's what you think you're looking at. So I'm more in a field of pure inquiry here than conclusion. But if you pushed me, yes, I tend to think that consciousness is not merely a product of our brains and bodies.
Okay, so but let's use the word pure inquiry. I want to loop it back to this this ever expanding world of AI, of information recombination and recapitulation, essentially replicating and reproducing and replacing human intellectual work. Okay. Now, this inquiry or this consciousness, how does that pure inquiry interface with AI? What is the interface there?
Well, I don't know about the pure consciousness with AI, but if pure consciousness is a stand-in concept for the fact that humans have all kinds of capability that are not necessarily reproducible within AI, and certainly don't exist in the AI we have today, then there's real room for humans in work, in interactive relationship with AI, and that AI not only can't, but shouldn't even be directed at replacing all forms of human work. So so I think that's the important interface there. And I believe that to be true. It's certainly true now because of a lot of the weaknesses in AI. I'll go back to moral decision making. I look at moral decision making as not, somebody telling you what's good, or you just apply these rules and you're a good person. I look at it as navigating uncertainty, the fact that we don't have all the information that we need, that we can't know the consequences of our action. As I look at it as a devilishly difficult problem that perhaps would go away if we had all the conceivable information in the universe, but that's just a theory also.
So in our society, which is becoming more and more reflective of bioengineering and artificial intelligence and technology in general, is there something that would be reflective of this silent mind? We can say let's say in our lives collectively and individually, we have the capacity to touch into something, whatever that is, deep inquiry, consciousness, some transcendental quality, which feels not personal, but connected to the personal, right? So in society, is there something emergent that is connected but not of the technological space? Because I think that's the question that we're trying to engage in this next culture network as a deep inquiry. Well, I don't know, and we don't know. We're obviously using technology here to interact with each other. But is there some other quality that is actually of value for the human being?
So there are three kinds of answers to that. Okay? I'm going to start with what I think is perhaps the most obvious but mundane, is just pure problem solving. We are good at problem solving. We do it on the fly. We integrate new information as it comes on. We can fathom ways of working through uncertainty and a lack of information. And that's probably why my public persona, for want of a better term, is that of an ethicist. That's why I put so much stress on ethics, because I think ethics is the core of problem solving. And when I'm talking about ethics, again, I'm talking about a new way of thinking about ethics as solving devilishly difficult problems, not as, applying the 10 Commandments. That's something else. Yeah. So, and I think that is what I call moral intelligence is going to be the hardest thing for AI ever to do. It can display, people have tested large language models with obvious problems, and they get a fairly high percentage of good responses, but it's just and they get some that are just so bonkers. And none of it is difficult problems. We're in a world of difficult problems now. Who among us has any solution to what the hell's going on in Gaza? Classic example of something daunting where I think for thoughtful people, they can't even figure out where to stand, let alone what should be done. And I'm not trying to criticize those who think they know what should be done or their concerns. I'm just kind of saying that's a devilishly difficult problem. When we talk about AI and how it's going to unfold, there are thousands of different pathways because AI can be applied in every conceivable frame of human life. But should it be applied in every frame of life? Should we be militarizing AI, for example? How are we going to deal with the fact that deep fakes are so easy that there are going to be tons of videos of Joe Biden falling flat on its face the day before the election? These are not simple issues. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about ethical decision making. And I think ethical decision making is where the practical world meets the inevitable realm of what's going on in each human individually. So that's one approach to the problem. And I think that's an approach to the problem that potentially can speak to everybody. But then there's other approaches to the problem which say that people who meditate, I'm going to use the extreme example, they will acquire miraculous powers. They will be able to become a giant in an instant or tiny or so forth. I think some of this is probably more metaphorical than factual, but I have to think it's metaphorical because I can't do it. I can't, disappear in an instant right before you, though I can by stepping back because it alters the visual thing of the screen, but that's just a magic trick. But the point is, what that is always pointed to is that some forms of understanding lead to ways of being in this world which have a different kind of an effect than just being another skin bag walking down the street. I happen to believe that's true, but that's also part of my inquiry. Is it really true? And what are the indications to me that there's some truth to that? And if there are realms for action that are not obvious physical actions, then what are those realms? And can that action be on occasion a salt march moment? I don't know how many of you know about the Gandhian salt march, but basically he walked to the sea, he sold a few grains of salt, and it was the equivalent of, in its time, of being the Boston Tea Party. And it totally changed the history of the world, that little action. So for me, salt march moments are those moments where sometimes if you see the right place, just a little nudge can change the trajectory. And a trajectory that has changed over time goes to a very different place. So that's a fascination for me, whether there's forms of action or whether all of that's self-delusion again. And in the process of making that inquiry, what do I learn? What do I learn about myself? What do I learn about the human condition? Does it have even mild personality effects? Maybe I'm more grateful than I used to be. I'm less pretentious. I'm still pretentious, but I'm just saying I'm less pretentious. I'm not, I had a kind of elitist arrogance that I didn't even always recognize was there. I probably still do, but some of the forms have just fallen away. So I think there's these multiple levels on which consciousness converges. I actually think that consciousness is a representation of a kind of integration that exists within our universe. And it exists on both a material level and on a spiritual level. So material level would be given that through evolution, animals that were relatively integrated and could find an environmental niche survived and reproduced. So being integrated is a way of, to the best of one's ability, and we're all working on integration because we're all fragmented in so many ways we don't even notice. Being integrated is a way of talking about a physical version of the soul But is it just physical? Is it just the relationship between the many cells and molecules in our body? Or does consciousness play a role in that integration? And not only that integration, but the integration of me with the environment that I'm moving through, with the space that I'm in. So in my mind, the key to ethics and consciousness studies is that we're all engaged in pursuing, we're all what I call cyber souls. We're all, yes, and the bottom line is we're biochemistry and computational mechanisms, but we're also souls in the sense that we need to find an integrated relationship both within ourselves and in relationship to the world we're interacting with, including that at a distance. And in that process, we become different kinds of presences in the world that have an effect. Whether it's just the causal effect or whether something acausal is going on, something that transcends the meanness of what I do, that's to be discovered.
We've had a couple of questions come in.
Right.
And so Gil is curious about, you were talking about AI hallucination. Is that maybe being related to imagination as we think of it?
It would be great if it was imagination. Whether AI really has imagination or not is a more complicated question. But what's happened is people have engaged with queries. So let's say you're querying ChatGPT and you ask it something. You ask it to tell you more about the history of Stephen Harrison. And it spouted out most of what it knows, right? And then it starts making up things that had nothing to do with Stephen's history. That's what a hallucination is. So hallucination is really when it's making up information, because it doesn't have, these systems do not have common sense reasoning. They don't have common sense at all. And there's a point at which they're engaged in a process that at some point gets distant from what they actually have the data on and starts to fabricate data that does not exist. So there's a very famous story of a lawyer in New York who asked AI to put together a brief, and then he submitted the brief in federal court. He'd been a lawyer in New York for 30 years. And his brief has 5 citations of things that do not exist. There was no court case, there was no, so that's made up information, and he will be chagrined forever because God knows how many people know his name.
Wow, that I had imagined that could possibly be happening with all that data mining.
I think what we're getting into here is, so you hear this mantra over and over again that the benefits of AI will far outweigh, the detriments. I think what we're getting into is this expanding portfolio of different detriments, and I'm not convinced that the benefits are going to outweigh the detriments. It has a lot to do with which of the detriments we figure out how to manage and which we don't. And if one of the detriments is that the AI oligopoly, or any of us who have stocks in the AI firms get richer and richer, but hundreds of millions of people starve, then that's not a benefit.
Right. Indeed.
And I don't care how you weigh one against the other. It's just not a benefit.
Yeah. So Colette brought up the question of, I'm just going to read it. So it says, in her question is that, so is the oversight or monitoring or regulation of AI that everyone is talking about, is that actual, or in practice the monitoring or regulation of humans? Or the egoic tendencies that that leans towards. So
Well, it's,
does that make sense?
yeah, that makes sense. And when people talk about AI ethics, there's two sides of it. One is what the technologies are doing, perhaps even unbeknownst to us, and what we need to find ways of regulating or building into those technologies constraints. And then the other side is what humans are doing with the technologies, right? So, so at the moment, I'm actually more concerned with what humans are doing with the technologies than I am with the technologies themselves, because you need a human to create a deep fake. You got to have a human tell a system to create a deep fake. So the question is, what are we regulating? Should we be regulating individual behavior? Should we be regulating corporate behavior, or should we be demanding more technological guidelines in how the systems are deployed? So all three of those are under discussion. I'm of the opinion that none of it is adequate in terms of what's being discussed today. But we will learn a lot over this next year because there are a number of major panels. You've got Schumer's bill, you've got who wins the election and what the president wants, you've got the EU, you got the OECD, you got UNESCO, you got the UN. There's a lot of different things going on and a lot of different proposals out there. My concern is I see that those that are coming out often get weakened for what I think are poor reasons. But I don't really know yet how this is all going to play out. I mean, I put my 2 cents in. I'm not sure how much more difference I'm going to make in any of this, but I do know that things that I have done are part and parcel of now what's under consideration. So I'm sort of a has-been at this point in that universe, or an old codger that people parade once in a while. But the fact is, suddenly AI ethics, which may have been 100 of us at most, 15, 20 years ago, is suddenly 10,000 people claiming to have different kinds of expertise. And some of them have no expertise at all, and some are really making a real difference in one facet or another. My concern is I don't know whether anybody's grasping the big picture well enough. Oh, excuse me.
And so this Colette's and Jen's questions kind of right on my own personal question, which is that you did mention all these different elements that are at play as far as regulation and things like that. And so Colette is wondering who regulates the regulators. And then Jen is wondering, is there any coordination regarding that through these large, the UN, the EU, and is there a possibility this could dominate the world?
Part of the problem. So if the regulators, so in America, the regulators are ultimately what the Congress does. And if the Congress is largely under the capture of the corporations and too many Congress people, are looking toward the hundreds of thousands of dollars they're going to get reelected, then they will have every excuse in the world not to pass anything with teeth, if that's what they want, So, so the regulators are Menendez and Chuck Schumer and all these names that you've been hearing over and over again, some with good reputation and some who are clearly corrupt. So we'll see. I mean, in America, corporate capture is a big thing, and the corporate capture is under the cult of innovation. And the cult of innovation is basically that we have to keep innovating, or we won't solve our problems. And therefore, putting in place regulations that interfere with innovation is not a good thing in principle. So then can you get any regulation at all? I mean, that's part of what we're dealing with. And of course, we're in competition with China. Therefore, if we don't do it, they'll do it. And of course, if we can subtly ratchet up pressure between America and China so that the competition is clear to everybody. And therefore, nobody wants us to put in place any regulations that will allow China to get ahead of us. So, and, you know, you may think I'm being fanciful here, but you may have heard of the name Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt ran Google for years because the founders of Google were too young to actually run it. Not that they were too young, they just didn't have enough corporate knowledge to run it. So they hired Eric Schmidt. So Eric Schmidt left Google with billions of dollars. And Eric Schmidt then goes and heads a panel on international security and AI, where the panel proposes that we have to build up our military AI capability because of China. And there you have Eric Schmidt sitting there with his billions of dollars, meaning God knows how many shares of AI stock. I mean, Eric Schmidt has a lot of respect in this world for a lot of reasons. I find it absolutely disgusting that he took on this role. And to make it worse, I think it was Eric Schmidt and I think it was Elon Musk, but it could have been somebody else. They come to Beijing to meet Xi Jinping. So who are they representing? What are they representing? What's their vision for what they want? So coordination, Jen. Let's just say there's enough of us involved in enough of the different initiatives that we've been trying to encourage it. And I think we've broken down some of the competition, but there's always competition. There's always competition between whose vision is going to prevail. And the problem is of the groups who are doing it, they each have different interests. The EU does not have the advanced capability that China and America have. So they're actually putting their boat in a wagon of being the lead regulators and say you can't do business here unless you put in place these kinds of regulations. And to some extent, that's having an effect. It's forcing companies who want to do business in the EU to do that kind of thing. But there's always competitive groups, and there's always ways in which individuals who really don't want things to happen to play the groups off against each other. I've been in UN meetings where, let's say, China or the US gets up and says, well, if everyone wants it, we're for a ban on lethal autonomous weapons, weapon systems that can pick their own target and destroy them without any real-time human intervention. But I know that both of those parties do things in back roads where they basically get their allies to not go along with it. China, if you're interested in China at all, I have a podcast that I did last week that's just gone online where it's with two young Chinese, and it's on AI safety and security research in China. Well, it's getting a lot of reading or listening to today because UN and China are meeting today to try and ensure that they don't do something stupid and get us into World War III. But the point is, China is, Xi Jinping is very vociferous about needing international regulation of AI. But when conversations went up about where the first recommended regulation was that no one would use AI in nuclear launch systems, my understanding is China refused to go along with that. So is there coordination? Is there cooperation? I don't mean to depress you, because all of this stuff is going on and a tremendous amount of this is going on, but it's still Russian roulette how the pieces are going to fall. I'm afraid I did depress you. Stephen, we need one more thing that gets us on a more positive note.
Oh my God. Yeah, we'll have to ask AI to help us build bomb shelters or something. Yeah, so I guess the question is, the question that occurs to me is there some action, some state of being, some state of consciousness that we can embody to address this, this emergent quality in our world, right? So, I mean, that's my question, is like, what do I need to embody that's informed by all the things we're talking about?
So, Stephen, that was my question when I first met you 40, 50 years ago. And that's still my question. That's still what drives my inquiry. My inquiry is a little different than it was then because I was naive about a lot of things and I was learning some basics that some of the wiser people in the world knew at the time. But so I think I understand some things, but my inquiry has not died because I think that is the question. And I've come out on the side of yes, there is. Either because I don't want to deal with the depression of finding out that I wasted my whole life, or because I'm seeing something. But I've asked constantly, how much of my life have I wasted meditating? That's a good inquiry style question. So I think yes, there is, but I think the problematics have always been, if the yes is real, it's the one you have to discover within your life. And it's not that what other people have or have not discovered, and you can find in books or in a conversation or whatever, is not valuable. It may even be valuable in the way that Rupert Sheldrake wants us to think, that one discovery is more easily accessible to everyone. So I think the answer is yes, but I've become more circumspect about how much I will say, because I've gone through a lifetime now of saying things and then finding out that people who were students or who called me a mentor or something, then come back with exact words that I use. But it's clear to me they have not grasped the meaning of those words in their own life.
Okay, well, I guess the inquiry continues for another 50 years. Let's see.
But there is
see.
A question in the inquiry about how much can even be understood in our own physical, biological forms. Are there limits to what we individually can understand? One of the things that was true 50 years ago is we talked a lot about the unconscious or the subconscious. And we really did believe, like good Freudians or whatever, that the neuroses that were interfering with my behavior were consciously accessible. And if we did the work, they would come to fore. But we're in a different universe now. We're in the universe where unbelievable amounts of information processing is going on unconscious, computational, and biochemical levels within each of our bodies at all times. So then the question is all of that accessible? Probably not. And does all of that need to be accessible? Probably not. But I happen to think that what consciousness is, or conscious attention is, it's directing our attention toward those elements that can be brought into consciousness, and once brought in consciousness, can be cleaned up.
Okay, I think we are at the end of our allotted time here. Wendell, I really thank you for taking your time to share with everybody. Well, I do want to thank
you, Stephen, because as I think you've all heard, we've roamed across a vast array of subject areas, and I very seldom get the opportunity to string all of that together. So I'm deeply grateful that you gave me this opportunity.
I think it's the feeling's mutual, and I think we collectively will continue the inquiry, and I guess we'll discover what it's all about. I will hold up this book to the camera if that's visible. Yeah. This is Wendell's book, available at Sentient Publications. He's got another book, which is, this is the first book. So both of,
I'll tell you the difference between the two. The first book was really about, can we implement moral decision-making capabilities in computers and robots? And in the process of asking that question, we probably looked more deeply at how humans make moral decisions than had ever been looked at before. And that's why that book gets quite a bit of attention. The second book was really my trying to figure out what information would a decent, intelligent human being need to be able to join all these exciting ethical, scientific, policy, and philosophical issues around emerging technologies. So it's kind of meant, to be the one book primer.
I will close by reading a line from Moral Machines, which I found fascinating, in which you talk about the possibility of creating greedy computer systems. And the line is, if greedy computer systems flourish, however, they're more likely to be greedy for energy or information than prestige, power, or sex. So there may be some improvement there. We don't know. Greedy for energy or information. Fascinating. Thank you, Wendell. And thank you for everybody who participated in this. And the experiment continues. Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thanks, Wendell.